Hello, everyone. Today, we're going to step into a moment that, at the time, felt like nothing at all. Just another ordinary morning, coffee cooling on the table, a half-open window letting in a lazy breeze, the hum of the refrigerator, the faint sound of traffic in the distance. And then, a look. She, my best friend, was standing across the kitchen counter, cradling her own mug like it was a shield. Her smile was there, but thinner, like tracing paper over something sharper. And in that instant, though I couldn't explain why, something inside me shifted. Not panic, not yet. Just a quiet awareness, a shadow stretching long before the storm. We had been inseparable for years, the kind of friends who finish each other's sentences, borrow each other's clothes, and have the kind of shorthand in conversation that makes outsiders feel like they're listening to a secret language. She knew my strengths, my insecurities, my dreams, especially the one I had worked for years to reach. She'd been my cheerleader, my sounding board, the person who'd remind me to believe in myself when I felt small. And that morning, she was pouring herself coffee in my kitchen like always. But her eyes weren't on me. They were measuring something, calculating. I didn't know it then, but that moment was the quiet, almost invisible crack in the glass. And like all small cracks, it would spread until the whole thing shattered. I told myself not to overthink it. We all have off days. Maybe she was tired. Maybe she was worried about something unrelated. And so, I smiled back, pushed the unease aside, and we talked about nothing in particular. Weekend plans, the weather, the TV series we'd been binging together. Everything felt normal enough, but I caught myself watching her as she laughed, noticing how her gaze slipped past me to the folder on my desk. The folder that held my upcoming project proposal. This was supposed to be my season. The big presentation was coming up, a career-defining opportunity I'd worked for months to secure. And she knew every detail. She'd seen my drafts, my research, my late-night notes scattered across the dining table. She'd even offered to help me rehearse, holding a mock audience face while sipping wine and giving feedback. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I'm doing here. And if you're watching right now, I'd love to know, where are you and what time of day is it as you're listening to this? Because I want you to picture it clearly. Your closest friend, your safest space, and the single, quiet moment you sense the tide starting to turn. That morning ended like countless others. She left with a wave, and I went back to my desk, opening my laptop and diving into work. But the image of her looking at that folder, it stayed with me. I told myself it was nothing, until the next few days began to prove otherwise. I wish I could say I was ready for what came next. But you don't prepare for betrayal. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't give you a deadline. It waits until you're fully invested, until you believe you're safe, and then, it changes everything. The opportunity came wrapped in a polite email. A line of text so formal it barely hinted at the weight it carried. We are pleased to inform you that your proposal has been selected for presentation at the annual summit. I stared at the words, my hands hovering above the keyboard, my heart thudding a little harder than it should. This was it. The thing I'd been quietly building toward for years, stacking late nights and early mornings into something solid enough to stand on. It meant more than just a presentation. It meant visibility, credibility, maybe even the kind of recognition that could change the entire trajectory of my career. She was the first person I told. Of course she was. I still believed then that we were a we, that news like this belonged to both of us in a way. Her reaction was perfect, too perfect. Her eyes widened. She gasped. She hugged me so tightly, I could feel her nails dig into my back for a second before she pulled away. "This is amazing," she said, her voice bright. "You have to let me help you get ready." And why would I say no? We'd always been each other's support system. She'd been there when I didn't get into my first choice program, when a client tried to undercut my rates, when my car broke down in the middle of the rain. I trusted her with my joy, my failure, my plans. So when she offered to help, I said yes without hesitation. The weeks that followed were a blur of preparation. She was there for all of it, helping me refine my slides, rearranging bullet points, even suggesting little tweaks to my delivery. Sometimes she'd linger on certain details of the proposal, asking me to explain them again, jotting down notes in her own notebook. I didn't think much of it. Why would I? She started attending casual networking events with me, always introducing herself as my right hand for the project. People seemed to like her. She was charming, quick to smile, the kind of person who knew how to make an impression in just a few minutes. I was grateful to have her there, especially since my own style was quieter, more focused on substance than small talk. We were a good team, or so I thought. One night, after a particularly long rehearsal, she leaned against my kitchen counter, swirling the last sip of wine in her glass. "You know," she said, "if anything happened and you couldn't do the presentation, I'd totally step in for you, just so you wouldn't lose the opportunity." It sounded like loyalty. It sounded like friendship. I smiled, touched, and said something about hoping it wouldn't come to that. She laughed. But now, looking back, I remember that laugh. It was just a little too knowing. The closer we got to the big day, the more she inserted herself into every conversation about the project. She'd answer questions for me, clarify points when I spoke, sometimes even contradict me gently in front of others, always with a soft laugh that made it seem harmless. I told myself it was fine. She was just enthusiastic. But then there were the odd moments, like when she asked for a copy of my slides, just in case. Or when she suggested I send her my speaking notes so she could check for typos. It was all so reasonable, so ordinary, that I didn't notice the pattern forming. Every step brought her closer to holding everything I'd built, until it was no longer in my hands at all. I should have seen it. I should have felt it the way I'd felt that first subtle shift in the kitchen weeks ago. But instead, I let her in. I gave her everything she needed, and soon she'd have everything she wanted. It began with something so small, it almost felt absurd to question it. A misplaced document. My rehearsal schedule, gone from the kitchen table where I'd left it the night before. I asked her about it casually the next day. She tilted her head, thinking for a moment, then said, "Oh, I thought you wanted me to take it and make a copy." I gave it back, didn't I? Her tone was light, dismissive. And maybe it was true. Maybe she had returned it and I'd misplaced it myself. I laughed it off, telling myself I was being ridiculous. But then, a few days later, an email I'd been waiting for, confirmation of the presentation time slot, never arrived in my inbox. I only found out about it when one of the coordinators mentioned the schedule in passing. "I sent you that update last week," she said. "Didn't you get it?" I searched my email. Nothing. Checked my spam folder. Still nothing. The coordinator frowned, pulled out her phone, and showed me the sent message. There it was. My name, but not my email address. It had been sent to an account eerily similar to mine, with one letter off. I didn't know it yet, but that wrong address belonged to my best friend. I remember the unease starting to coil low in my stomach. I didn't have proof, just shadows. But shadows can be enough to make you double-check the locks on your door at night. She was still smiling through it all, still helping me. If anything, she seemed more invested than ever, showing up unannounced with takeout, insisting we rehearse again, offering to run interference with people who might distract me. At first, I thought she was protecting me. Now, I wonder if she was isolating me. The real shift came one afternoon when I arrived at the office for a project meeting. I was early, 10 minutes early, but when I opened the conference room door, she was already there, sitting in my chair, laptop open, my slides on the screen. She didn't notice me at first. She was too busy speaking to the others, explaining one of my points as if it were her own. And she was good, confident, polished. Better even than I had been in my last rehearsal. When she finally saw me, her expression didn't falter for more than a heartbeat. "Hey, I was just getting them up to speed for you." She slid out of my seat, smiling, making it all look harmless. But I knew. I didn't have the words for it yet, but I knew. From that point on, little things began to pile up. Comments made in meetings that undermined me. I think what she meant to say was, subtle corrections in front of people whose opinions mattered. And when I wasn't there, she made sure to be the one they turned to for updates. It was death by 1,000 cuts, each one small enough to ignore if you wanted to. And I wanted to. Because admitting what was happening meant accepting that my best friend wasn't my friend at all. Still, there was one thing I couldn't ignore. The day I came in early again, too early, and found her in the copy room. She was holding a printed version of my full proposal. When she saw me, she froze for just a second too long before saying, "Oh, I was making a backup for you." Her smile didn't reach her eyes. I thanked her anyway, because that's what you do when the truth is too heavy to carry all at once. You take it piece by piece, even if it's slowly crushing you. The morning it all broke open was quiet. Too quiet. No phone calls, no last-minute emails. Just a strange, heavy stillness that sat in the air like a storm waiting to strike. I was supposed to be heading into the city for our final rehearsal before the summit. The presentation was in 3 days. 3 days. Every detail had been nailed down. My slides, my talking points, even the pacing of my walk to the podium. I'd rehearsed so many times that I could recite the opening paragraph in my sleep. I arrived at the venue early, the way I always did. But when I walked into the rehearsal space, I froze. My name wasn't on the schedule posted outside the door. Her name was. I thought it had to be a mistake, some kind of printing error. I pushed the door open and stepped inside, only to see her standing at the front, my slides on the screen, my notes in her hand. She was mid-sentence, confidently explaining a concept I'd spent months refining. The audience, a few coordinators and event staff, nodded, engaged, taking notes. My breath caught. She didn't stumble when she saw me at the back of the room. She just smiled, like we'd planned it this way all along. "Oh, hey," she said, voice smooth. "I was just running through it for them since you were busy." Busy? I hadn't been late. I hadn't missed a single rehearsal. I stood there, half in the doorway, half in a fog, as the coordinator turned to me with an awkward smile. "We thought you'd decided to pass the torch. She said you weren't feeling up to presenting and asked to step in. Of course, we wanted to make sure the work stayed in capable hands." The words felt like a slap I didn't see coming. I opened my mouth to speak, but she was already wrapping up the section, clicking through the slides with a casual confidence that left no room for interruption. It was like watching someone move into your house while you stood there, powerless to stop them. Your furniture, your photos, your clothes, all relabeled as theirs. Afterward, I pulled her aside in the hallway. "What's going on?" My voice was low, but my hands trembled. She didn't flinch. "Relax. It's just one run-through. I thought it might be good to give them options." Options. Like I was a spare part she could swap out at will. I wanted to fight it, to march back in there and make it clear the project was mine. But the truth was, she'd been laying the groundwork for weeks. She'd been the one answering the coordinator's emails when I didn't respond, because they'd been going to her. She'd been the one introducing herself as my collaborator, my backup, my co-presenter. To them, this wasn't a hostile takeover, it was a logical next step. And just like that, I was on the outside of my own work, watching her inhabit it as if it had always belonged to her. When I left the building that day, the city felt different. The air was colder, the streets sharper. I kept thinking about that moment in the kitchen weeks ago. The thin smile, the calculating look. I realized now it hadn't been my imagination. It had been the first move in a game I didn't know I was playing.
If I thought losing my place in the rehearsal was the worst of it, I was wrong. That was only the curtain rising. The real performance, hers, was just beginning. The next morning, I woke to a string of unread messages from colleagues. Polite, clipped, oddly formal. Each one congratulated her on stepping up so gracefully. One even thanked me for making the mature choice to let her present. I stared at the screen, rereading those words until they blurred. Mature choice. I hadn't made a choice at all. I called the coordinator, hoping to straighten it out. Her voice was warm but careful, like she was speaking to someone unstable. She told us you'd been under a lot of stress. that you wanted to focus on the research side while she took care of the public speaking. I could almost hear the subtext. We're protecting your pride by believing her version. The anger came slow, creeping in like water under a closed door. It wasn't just that she had taken my place. It was that she'd made sure there was no fight left in me. Because to fight, I would have to look like I was clawing my way back into something I'd supposedly stepped away from voluntarily. And she'd already painted that picture. Me as the exhausted friend, the one too fragile to handle the spotlight. Over the next 2 days, she solidified her role in ways that felt almost surgical. She updated the presentation slides, removing my name from the opening, tweaking the phrasing in ways small enough to pass as editing, but large enough to change the rhythm I'd built. She sent logistical updates to the team, all from her email address, with phrases like, "As I mentioned in our last call, and my final revisions are attached." Every thread of the project now ran through her hands. Our mutual friends were no help. When I tried to vent, they shifted uncomfortably, offering weak smiles and vague reassurances. She probably meant well. "Maybe this is a good break for you." One even said, "It's not worth losing a friendship over," as if the friendship hadn't already been gutted and left for dead. The night before the summit, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying every moment over the past month. The missing rehearsal schedule, the misdirected email, the copy of my proposal in her hands. Pieces that had seemed isolated now fit together like a puzzle. She hadn't just stumbled into my place. She had built a staircase to it, step by step. And I had handed her the materials. The morning of the event, I didn't go. Not because I couldn't, but because I realized the fight was already lost. The room would be hers, the applause would be hers. And any attempt I made to correct the record would only make me look petty, bitter, unprofessional. She'd designed it that way. Instead, I sat in my living room, coffee in hand, sunlight spilling across the floor, and felt the quiet weight of it settle. This wasn't just about losing a presentation. It was about losing the space I'd worked years to claim, and knowing the person who took it had worn my trust like a key around her neck.
If the summit had been the finish line for her, it was the starting gun for something far more insidious. Because once she stood in my place, once she proved she could pull it off, she didn't just keep the position. She began rewriting the entire story of how she got there. I started hearing fragments of it in the weeks that followed. At first, it was small, comments drifting back to me through colleagues or mutual friends. "She told us you'd been thinking about stepping back for a while. She said she encouraged you to take more time for yourself." It was all phrased in this benevolent, almost sisterly tone, as though she had been doing me a kindness. But then the narrative shifted. Somewhere along the way, I became the unreliable one, the person who couldn't handle deadlines, who struggled under pressure, someone who'd dropped the ball so badly that she had to swoop in to save the day. And because she'd just proven herself in front of the entire industry, no one questioned it. Every time I tried to correct the record, I hit the same wall. Polite nods, tight smiles, that faint glaze in their eyes that told me they'd already chosen which version to believe. It was easier for them to accept her story. Cleaner, less messy than acknowledging that she'd deliberately pushed me out. Even our personal history started to morph in her retelling. Stories we'd lived together, moments that had once been ours, came back to me twisted. In her version, she was the one who'd taken the lead on every project, solved every crisis, carried me through every challenge. I could feel her taking ownership not just of my work, but of my past. And there's something uniquely disorienting about hearing your own memories spoken aloud, but not as you remember them. Mutual friends began to behave differently around me. They still invited me to things, but I noticed the subtle changes. How she was always the one telling the group stories now, how they'd glance at her for confirmation, even when I spoke about something I'd experienced firsthand. It was like she'd positioned herself as the authority on me. I tried once to sit her down and confront her, to ask why she was doing this. She smiled, soft, almost pitying, and said, "I'm just helping you. You don't see it now, but one day you'll thank me." The way she said it made my skin crawl, because it wasn't just confidence, it was certainty. The certainty of someone who believed she'd already won. That night, I lay awake turning over the same question. How do you fight back when the person has taken not just your place, but the right to tell your story? It wasn't about reclaiming the spotlight anymore. It was about reclaiming my own voice in a room where hers had already filled every corner. And the worst part? I still didn't know just how far she was willing to go, but I was about to find out. The next phase of her plan didn't come with a loud announcement. It arrived like the slow tightening of a knot, barely noticeable at first, until I realized I couldn't move without feeling it pull. The invitations stopped coming. Not all at once, and not in a way that anyone outside the situation would notice. It started with group emails I wasn't copied on, meetings that somehow got rescheduled without my knowledge. Even casual coffee catch-ups with colleagues faded into silence. I'd only find out about them afterward, when someone mentioned a conversation I'd never been part of. I knew she was behind it before I had proof. The signs were too clean, too deliberate. She'd inserted herself into every circle we used to share, professional and personal, and positioned herself as the gatekeeper. If you wanted access to the group, you went through her. And slowly, people stopped seeing me as part of it at all. I remember one evening in particular, a networking event at a rooftop bar, one I'd attended every year. This time, I didn't get an invite. I only found out it was happening when I saw the photos on social media. There she was, front and center in every shot, smiling beside people I'd introduced her to, wearing the necklace I'd once given her for her birthday. Every caption read like she'd been part of the core group for years, as if I'd never existed in it. I thought about going anyway, just showing up. But then I pictured the tight smiles, the awkward glances, the way she'd probably wrap an arm around me in front of everyone and say, "Oh, you made it," like I was a surprise guest at my own life. I stayed home. The isolation was worse than the public loss of my role. Because when you're removed from the spaces that once defined you, it's not just your work that disappears. It's the web of connections, the casual conversations, the shared moments that keep your name alive in people's minds. Without those, you fade faster than you think. And she knew it. That's why she didn't just take my place. She sealed the exits. Any attempt I made to step back in was met with the same rehearsed sweetness. "Oh, I didn't think you'd want to be involved after everything." Or, "I wasn't sure you were ready to come back into the fold." It was always framed as concern, always justifiable to an outsider. I began to realize she wasn't just replacing me. She was erasing me, not in one sweeping move, but in careful, precise strokes. A name left off a list here, a forgotten introduction there. Until one day, the people who used to greet me warmly were tilting their heads, trying to remember where they knew me from. The worst part? It was working, and I was running out of ways to pretend it wasn't. I told myself I'd confront her, face to face. No games, no carefully worded emails, just the truth, spoken plainly. But every time I tried, she slipped away like water through my hands. The first time, she was in meetings all day. The second, she wasn't feeling well and suggested we reschedule. By the third attempt, I got a breezy text saying, "Things are so busy right now, maybe after the summit season calms down." Summit season had ended 2 months ago. It wasn't just avoidance, it was strategy. Because while she dodged me, she was busy building a new layer of insulation around herself. People. She surrounded herself with colleagues, friends, acquaintances, who now acted as her unofficial messengers. Any time I got close to cornering her, someone would step in with a smile, a change of subject, or a gentle reminder of how grateful she'd been for my so-called decision to step back. It was like trying to have a private conversation in the middle of a crowded room where everyone is on her side. And maybe they were, because by then, she'd spent months crafting the image of herself as the one who saved the project, who stepped in when I faltered, who took on the pressure I couldn't handle. The closest I came to breaking through was one rainy Tuesday afternoon. I spotted her leaving the office, umbrella in hand, the streetlight catching the silver clasp of her coat. I matched her pace, falling in step beside her. For a moment, it felt like old times. Two friends walking in sync, sharing the same patch of sidewalk. But when I spoke, her eyes stayed forward. "You've made it impossible for me to even explain my side," I said. She didn't stop walking, didn't flinch. "I've just been telling the truth," she replied, her tone calm, almost bored. "And if that's made things difficult for you, maybe you should think about why." It was so clean, so deliberate, that I almost admired it. Because she wasn't denying anything outright. She was framing the entire conversation so that if I pushed, I'd look defensive, like someone caught in a lie. We reached the corner where our paths split. She opened her umbrella, looked at me for the first time, and smiled. "I really do wish you the best." And then she was gone, swallowed up by the rain and the crowd, leaving me standing there with the taste of metal in my mouth. That was the last time I tried to speak to her directly, not because I didn't have more to say, but because I understood something in that moment. She wasn't interested in resolving anything. She was interested in winning, and every attempt I made to confront her only gave her another opportunity to twist the story. From then on, I knew, if I was going to protect what little I had left, I'd have to change my approach. But before I could even make a move, she was already preparing her final play. The final push didn't come like a storm. It came like a quiet change in the air, subtle, almost unnoticeable, until I realized I was standing in a room that no longer belonged to me. It began with an email marked urgent. It wasn't addressed to me directly, but I was CC'd, sandwiched between a string of names that had once been my team. The subject line read, "Transition of Responsibilities." I opened it, heart pounding. The words were polite, professional, and as sharp as glass. Due to organizational needs and workflow efficiencies, my duties would be reassigned. No mention of my choice in the matter. No acknowledgement of the years I had built those duties into something worth taking. Just a neatly written note to let everyone know that as of Monday, she would be the point of contact. I read it 3 times, scanning for some loophole, some way to frame it as temporary. But it was clear. This wasn't a shift in workload. This was a full handover. Every responsibility I had left was sliding into her hands. By noon, she was at my desk, smiling. That same thin smile I'd seen in my kitchen months ago. "Hey," she said, leaning casually against the edge of my workspace. "I just wanted to say, no hard feelings. I know this is probably hard, but it's really what's best for the team." I stared at her, wondering if she believed her own words or if she just enjoyed the performance. She tapped the desk lightly. "I'll make sure your contributions aren't forgotten." Then she walked away before I could answer. That afternoon, I tried to speak to the director, but the conversation was short and the message was clear. "She's already been doing most of this work for months. It makes sense to make it official." Months. She'd been framing me out of the picture for months, and now they were simply formalizing what she had engineered behind the scenes. When I left the office that day, my badge felt heavier than usual around my neck. The building I'd once entered with pride now felt like a place I was trespassing in. She'd taken the position, the recognition, the narrative, and now the last remnants of my authority. The worst part wasn't that she'd won. It was that she'd made sure I couldn't even fight back without looking like the bitter one, the sore loser. Because she hadn't broken any rules. She'd played inside the lines, smiling the entire time, until the game board belonged entirely to her. I went home that night to a silent apartment, sat at my kitchen table, and stared at the folder that had started it all. The proposal, the notes, the slides. It was all still there, untouched. Proof that it had been mine once. But now, even if I held it up to the world, no one would believe it. She hadn't just taken my place. She'd built a world where I no longer existed in it. In the days that followed, I drifted through a kind of numb routine. Emails, coffee, half-hearted conversations. But beneath the surface, I was combing through every interaction, every scrap of memory, looking for proof. Anything I could hold in my hands to remind myself I hadn't imagined it all. The proof came unexpectedly. Late one evening, I stayed in the office after most people had left. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting that pale, tired glow that makes every shadow feel a little longer. I'd gone to the copy room to grab some printouts, And there, tucked into the tray beneath a stack of old reports, I saw it. A notebook, her notebook. I knew it instantly. The leather cover, the faint ink stain on the spine. We'd been at a cafe when she bought it, saying she needed something just for project notes. I shouldn't have opened it, but I did. The first few pages were harmless. Doodles, brainstorming lists, phrases I recognized from our early rehearsals. Then the tone shifted. Pages of observations about me, written in a tidy, deliberate hand. How I presented myself in meetings, who I spoke to most often, moments when I seemed distracted or under pressure. Even notes about personal things, when I was tired, when I skipped lunch, when I left early. It read less like a partner's support notes and more like a strategy manual. In the margins, she'd written ideas for transition points in the project, times when she could step in naturally. Some entries were almost chilling in their precision. Secure final draft of slides. Offer to proofread. Keep copy. Redirect email updates to my account. Frame as helping with workload. Establish role as default spokesperson in casual settings. I stood there in the empty copy room, the sound of the air vent the only thing breaking the silence, and felt my chest tighten. It wasn't just betrayal. It was premeditation. I slipped the notebook into my bag, every step back to my desk feeling heavier than the last. At home, I read it cover to cover. It was all there. The missing documents, the redirected emails, even the subtle ways she'd isolated me from the team. Every move had been calculated, months in advance. And yet, the realization hit me like cold water. Having proof didn't mean I could use it, because if I exposed her, I'd have to admit I'd ignored the signs, handed her the tools, even thanked her for helping me along the way. And to the people who'd already chosen her version of events, my evidence would look like bitterness dressed up as documentation. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, the notebook open in front of me, and weighed my options. I could fight back, go to leadership, confront her publicly, burn whatever remained of our shared circles. Or I could walk away, keep my dignity intact, and let her keep the crown she'd stolen. It was the kind of choice that doesn't feel like a choice at all, because either way, you lose something you can't get back. For days, that notebook sat on my coffee table like a living thing. Every time I passed it, I felt its weight, not just the paper and ink, but the months of planning, the precision of each move, the coldness of it all. I thought about taking it to HR. I even drafted an email once, fingers hovering over the send button. But I could already picture the meeting room, the polite faces, the careful language. We can't take action on this. It's not against policy. It sounds like a misunderstanding. She'd built her game inside the rules, and I knew it. There was another option, revenge. I could leak the contents quietly, let the right people discover her tactics, watch her credibility crumble. But the idea made my stomach twist. Not because she didn't deserve it, but because I could see exactly how she'd spin it. She'd call it a smear campaign. She'd make it about my resentment, my inability to move on. And people would believe her, because she'd spent months preparing them to. So I did what I never imagined I would. I put the notebook in a drawer. Not as evidence, not as a weapon, just as a reminder. A reminder of what it looks like when you trust the wrong person, and of the cost of mistaking proximity for loyalty. The decision left me hollow. It wasn't peace. It was more like standing on the far side of a closed door, hearing a conversation you'll never be part of again. She'd taken my place, yes. But worse, she'd taken the fight out of me. And yet, in that hollow space, something else began to take shape. I realized I'd been circling her shadow for months, defining every choice by what she'd done. If I kept going, she'd still be controlling me, just from a different seat. So I started small, a lunch with someone outside our shared circles, a coffee meeting with an old contact who remembered me before all this. At first, it felt like slipping out the back door of a house I'd once lived in, keeping my head down so no one would notice. But each step away from her orbit felt a little lighter. I wasn't winning anything back. I wasn't beating her, but I was reclaiming the one thing she hadn't managed to touch, my ability to choose where I stood next. One night, sitting in the quiet, I thought about what it would mean to truly let go. Not forgive, not forget. Just let her keep what she'd taken and take myself somewhere she couldn't follow. It wasn't the ending I wanted, but maybe it was the only one I could live with. When I finally stepped out of her shadow, I didn't announce it. There was no dramatic resignation, no fiery speech in a conference room. I simply stopped showing up to the places she had made her own. It was strange at first, how quickly the noise faded. No more carefully worded updates meant to undercut me. No more sidelong glances across meeting tables. No more weighing every word, wondering how she might twist it later. It was quiet. So quiet that I didn't realize how exhausting the constant defense had been until it was gone. I took on freelance projects, small at first, then bigger. Work where my name was on every page, where no one else could accidentally speak in my place. I reached out to contacts outside the circles she controlled, people who didn't even know her name. And little by little, I began to build something again. But the strangest part was what happened in my personal life. Friends I hadn't heard from in months started reaching out. They'd noticed things, they said. Small inconsistencies in her stories. Moments where she spoke about me in ways that didn't quite add up. No one apologized outright. It wasn't that kind of conversation. But I could feel the edges of her version of events beginning to fray. I didn't feed it, didn't hand them the notebook, didn't recount every detail. Instead, I just listened, letting them come to their own conclusions. Because by then, I'd learned something important. Truth has its own pace, and when you try to force it into the light, people shield their eyes. One afternoon, months later, I heard she'd been given another big opportunity, one that required a level of skill she didn't actually have. It wasn't schadenfreude I felt. It was something quieter, heavier. Because I knew she'd try to fake her way through it, the same way she had with my work. And this time, I wouldn't be there to supply the substance behind her confidence. That night, I opened the drawer where the notebook still sat. I ran my hand over the cover, feeling the worn leather under my fingertips. And then I closed the drawer again. I didn't need it anymore. I'd thought that walking away meant losing. But the more distance I put between us, the more I saw it differently. She had my place, yes, but I had something she would never get back. The trust of those who truly knew me, and the freedom to move without her shadow cutting across my path. And sometimes that's enough. Life outside her orbit felt almost foreign at first, like moving to a city where I didn't know the streets yet. Every interaction was a little tentative, every opportunity a cautious step forward. But there was relief in it too. Relief in knowing that each move I made now was my own, untouched by her fingerprints. Still, she wasn't gone. Not completely. Her name would surface in conversations, usually attached to some accomplishment or accolade. People would smile when they mentioned her, not realizing the way my stomach tightened each time. I learned to keep my face neutral, to nod politely, to steer the topic elsewhere without letting the shift show in my voice. It wasn't about pretending it hadn't happened. It was about refusing to let her name dictate the temperature of the room. Then, one evening, I saw her again. It was at an industry gala, one of those events where the air smells faintly of perfume and champagne, and the lighting is low enough to make everyone look a little softer. I hadn't planned on going, but a client insisted. And there she was, across the room, wearing a dress the color of deep wine, a glass in her hand, the same smile she'd worn on the day she took my place. She noticed me almost instantly. Our eyes met. For a moment, the room seemed to still. Then she began to walk toward me. I braced myself for a confrontation, but when she reached me, she simply tilted her head and said, "It's been a while." Her tone was light, almost friendly, as if we'd parted on good terms, as if the months in between had been nothing more than a gap in our calendars. We exchanged a few lines of small talk, weather, mutual acquaintances, the safe territory people use when they're pretending there's no history between them. But beneath it, I could feel the quiet tension, like a wire stretched between us. She was studying me, I realized, not to undermine, not to corner, but to measure, to see if I still carried the weight she'd left on my shoulders. I didn't. Not in the way she expected. When the conversation reached its natural end, I smiled, genuinely, without malice, and excused myself. I walked away before she could respond, leaving her standing there with her glass, the music and laughter swirling around her. It wasn't victory, it wasn't closure, but it was mine. And for the first time since she'd taken my place, I felt the quiet certainty that I was no longer part of her game. After that night, I didn't see her for months. Her name floated around the edges of my world, always secondhand, always in passing, but it no longer carried the same sting. It was like hearing about a place I'd once lived in, far enough in the past that the streets felt unfamiliar in my mind. I was busy. Work was steady, and the projects I took on were mine from start to finish. The kind of work where every choice had my fingerprint on it, where every success, no matter how small, felt unshakably earned. I was meeting new people, too. Not mutual friends, not anyone tied to the tangled web she'd woven, but people who knew me without the filter of her stories. One afternoon, a former colleague called. We hadn't spoken in over a year, not since before the summit. He hesitated at first, then admitted, "I think I owe you an apology." Apparently, things in her world hadn't gone as smoothly as she'd planned. Deadlines missed, details overlooked, promises unkept. The confidence she'd carried into my place had crumbled under the weight of having to sustain it without anyone else to feed her the foundation. I didn't gloat, didn't even let him hear the sharp satisfaction that flickered in my chest. Instead, I said, "I hope she finds her way." And I meant it, because by then, I understood something she never had. You can take someone's place, but you can't take the years they spent building the ground beneath it. That night, I sat with that thought for a long time. It wasn't about getting even anymore. It wasn't even about reclaiming what I'd lost. It was about knowing that I'd built myself twice, once before her and once after. And the second time, I'd done it without needing anyone to hand me the tools. The notebook was still in the drawer. I opened it one last time, flipping through the neat, careful handwriting. Then, I tore out a single blank page, wrote a few words to myself, nothing she would ever read, and closed it for good. The rest of it could sit there, untouched, until the day I decided it no longer mattered enough to keep. Because the real victory wasn't in exposing her. It was in outgrowing the space she'd taken. The last time I thought of her clearly was on a quiet night, months after that phone call. I was sitting by the window, lights dimmed, watching the city soften under a curtain of slow-moving clouds. The air was still, and in that stillness, her face rose in my mind. Not sharp with betrayal, not triumphant with victory, but blurred, almost like a fading photograph. I remembered the kitchen that morning, the thin smile, the calculating look. I remembered the meetings I was locked out of, the stories rewritten in my absence, the way she stood in my place and made it look effortless. I remembered the hollow ache of realizing there was no way to fight back without stepping straight into the trap she'd built for me. But then the images shifted. I saw the first freelance project I took after walking away, my name alone on the title page. I saw the friends who had found their way back, not because I demanded it, but because they began to see me without her filter. I saw the version of myself that had emerged, not untouched by what happened, but no longer defined by it. The weight had lessened. It hadn't vanished, but it no longer pressed on my chest the way it once did. And I realized that letting go hadn't been a single moment. It had been a long, slow unwinding, like loosening a knot until the cord falls slack in your hands. Some betrayals leave you with a hunger for justice that never fades. Others teach you that the truest justice is a life lived far beyond the reach of the person who tried to break you. She had taken my place, and she had won the game she was playing. But I had stopped playing, and that, in its own quiet way, felt like the greater freedom. I leaned back in my chair, listening to the hum of the city outside. Somewhere out there, she might still be telling her version of the story, still stepping into spaces that once could have been mine. But the thought no longer stung, because those spaces no longer belonged to me. not in loss, not in longing. They were simply part of a story I had already closed. The clouds drifted past the window, the light shifting gently across the floor. And in that softened silence, I whispered a goodbye. Not to her, but to the weight of her shadow. A goodbye that was less an ending and more a quiet turning toward whatever waited next. Thank you for reading the whole story. Hope you will support my next products.